Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you are safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today is the first Carnegie Connects of the new year, and there's no one better to kick it off than Francis Fukuyama. No one I trust more with the subject at hand, the state and fate of America's democracy or the republic in the age of Trump. And no one, I think, who can better help us get beyond the headlines to suss out perhaps some of the trend lines. It's also a special privilege for me to have Frank here. Not only is he a non-resident fellow scholar at Carnegie, but he's a former colleague of mine at the Policy Planning Staff Department of State during some very extraordinary years. I also know that Frank, in his first stint at policy planning, wrestled, I think I'm right, Frank, wrestled with the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian issues. So we share those experiences as well. Frank needs no introduction. I'll give him a short one. He deserves much more. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also a faculty member of FSI's Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. He's written widely on issues in development, international politics. His 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, has appeared in over 20 foreign editions. And his latest book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, was published in May of 2022. Frank, welcome to Carnegie Connects. It's really great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. We do go back a long ways.
Indeed.
I decided in the early 80s, that was probably the high point of hopefulness about the Middle East and prospects for peace. But I decided then that I didn't really see that this was going to end up in a really successful enterprise, but you stuck it out all these years. So.
Yeah, it's a smart move on your part, Frank. I'm not sure quite where to begin. 3 weeks into Donald Trump's non-consecutive second term, we've witnessed a flood of executive orders, actions, pronouncements, policy initiatives that could only be described based on almost my 50 years in Washington. Hard to believe. 27 of them in government can only be described as head exploding. Maybe Peter Baker, the New York Times, summed it up best. Quote, Trump has thrown the nation's capital into turmoil, purging enemies at home, attacking allies abroad, shuttering one agency while targeting others, handing the tools of government to an unelected billionaire, ignoring multiple laws, trying to rewrite the Constitution, and even flirting with staying in power beyond his 2-term limit. I warn you, Frank, that'll be the last question I'm going to ask you. So I guess I want to divide our conversation, and we only have 45 minutes, into 3 15-minute parts. One, what is Trump 2.0 trying to achieve? Number two, can it be achieved? And number three, the hardest of all, but I know you'll have stuff to say on it. Where does the republic go from here? So first, what does Trump 2.0 want? Days after the election, you wrote in the Financial Times that the issue before us wasn't as much as a matter of how policy might change, although it has, but far more what you termed, quote, a decisive rejection by voters of liberalism and the way the understanding of a free society has evolved since the 1980s. You then went on to say that Trump, quote, is inaugurating a new era in U.S. politics and perhaps the world as a whole. What did you mean by that?
So I think it's important to distinguish between two different types of changes that have occurred. So there's policy changes. Trump is going to tighten up the border. He's going to impose tariffs. He may move the tax base away from, what exists previously onto something else. So these are kind of normal things. You may disagree with them. They may have bad consequences, but this is what happens after elections. The more important thing are institutional changes that I would say aren't simply modifications of what exists, but they're a full-scale, very, very radical attack on the American constitutional system as we've understood it, and therefore, really an attack on American democracy. So there's been this blizzard, as you mentioned, of executive orders that have come out of the White House in the first, what are we, into the third week now of the Trump administration. But apart from individual ones like the ending of birthright citizen or the attempt to end birthright citizenship, there's a deeper theme, which is just that he's doing everything by executive order. Normally, you elect a president. If they've got a compliant Congress, they then start a congressional agenda to change policy. But Trump is trying to do everything simply by these dicta coming out of the White House. And many of them are totally illegal, and many of them are totally unconstitutional. For example, the failure to spend money that Congress has appropriated. Congress in Article 1 is given the power of the purse, not the president. President's job is to see that the laws are faithfully executed, which means that that money that Congress appropriates should be spent. But basically, Trump has empowered Elon Musk to withhold money for any activity that Elon Musk, thinks is illegitimate. And this is an usurpation of the congressionally established power of Congress to make this kind of decision. And it's made even worse by the fact that a lot of these decisions are actually being taken by these 20-something engineers that really have no understanding of, how the American government works, what these appropriations are meant to do, and the like. And, it's going to be challenged in the courts. There have been, many, many lawsuits challenging both the legality and the constitutionality of these moves. But the problem is that the damage will be done by the time the courts get around. Well, I guess this is what you wanted to do in the third segment, so maybe we'll back off from that. But there's a lot of immediate damage that's going on right now. One of the things that I care about is, for example, the National Endowment for Democracy. This is a taxpayer-funded organization that supports human rights activists, democracy activists, labor unions, a lot of organizations around the world. I was on their board for 18 years, and they're basically in the process of being forced to close down because the Treasury has cut off their funds. And this is happening across thousands of organizations that have been expecting to, the money's in the bank, Congress appropriated the money, but Musk will not let the actual payments be made into their bank accounts. And so he's reshaping the nature of American government in this completely illegal way. And I think that's really, the fundamental challenge to the institutions, the underlying institutions, and not simply reflective of policy changes.
Right. Before we leave the broad that broad thing, because that it's compelling, it's dangerous, it's quite terrifying. I just want to understand something. I think Harry Truman once quipped that Nixon may have read the Constitution, but he didn't understand it. I wonder. The Constitution, it's not even a question of not understanding it. It seems to me that there's been an effort simply to ignore and or bypass it. There are constitutional scholars who are convinced already that we've run through norms and institutions and we're already in a constitutional crisis. But I wanted to ask you about this assault on, because I know you've written about this and it's really important. Are you saying that the classic sort of liberalism that has driven the republic, the rule of law, the respect for the equal dignity of the individual rights, constitutional checks and balances, that all of that is really what is now under assault?
No, absolutely. Look, if you ask what the liberal part of liberal democracy is all about, it is about the rule of law. It is about the fact that the executive doesn't have unlimited authority to do whatever that person wants. And if you basically don't follow the law anymore, you are busting through all of those constraints and you're behaving like a tyrant and an authoritarian leader. And I think that that's exactly what we're witnessing at the present moment. And I think one of the things that we've kind of come to recognize in these in this Trump era is that the rule of law, it's not like a physical obstacle that prevents the government from doing something. It's just norms, that the court says you can't do something, and so the president agrees not to do it. But, what happens if that agreement isn't there and the norm doesn't apply? We're going to see a test of that, coming up. But I think that's really what's disturbing, is that once you undermine that normative agreement on how the laws should be obeyed and interpreted, how are we going to get that back? I think, Trump is not going to live forever, but in a way, the institutions that are supposed to outlive any particular individual occupying the office of the presidency, if they are undermined and changed, it's going to be very hard to get back to where we were.
I mean, the nation's been through all kinds of crises. Obviously, the worst crisis that any nation faced, which was civil war. But I think I'm more inclined to believe now that we've never been here before. And I know one of the things that you focused on, and I'm fascinated by, had 27 years, first as a Foreign Service Reserves officer, then as a civil servant. Can you talk a little bit about Schedule F? Explain to our listeners exactly what it is and what your views are on what is, it seems to me, a major effort led by Musk and others, to both install loyalists, control data, gain control of funding, eliminate jobs and programs that simply aren't aligned with someone's whims and fancies or their ideological objectives. It's much less about reform and fiscal responsibility. It seems to me there's a full-blown effort to hollow out the institutions of governance and the so-called deep state. So what is Schedule F exactly, Frank, and how are they going about implementing it?
Well, we need a little history lesson here. In the 19th century, Donald Trump's favorite president, Andrew Jackson, instituted what has come to be called the spoils system, or the patronage system, in which basically every federal employee, every civil servant was a political appointee put there as a reward to a political supporter by some politician. This began to change in the 1880s with something called the Pendleton Act, where they created for the first time a merit-based system where you couldn't just appoint anybody. They had to take a civil service exam, have qualifications, so that the government would be run by professionals. Now, in democratic theory, there's no question that presidents who are elected get the right to choose senior cabinet officers and change policy. But there's also been, I think, a kind of wisdom about modern government that there are certain roles that should not be politicized because they simply serve public interest. And what you want is a solid professional. So among them, these are offices with what's called for cause removal, where you can't simply put your own person in. The Bureau of the Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Internal Revenue Service, right? These are all organizations that are typically run by professional civil servants who have a lot of background in what they do, and they're not political appointees. What's happening today is Trump is asserting the right to fire and replace any civil servant, regardless of those kinds of legal protections. And you just imagine what that could mean for good government. In fact, Richard Nixon tried to do this back in the 70s, use the IRS to target audits against his political enemies. And that's why you want a non-political professional in that kind of a role. And so there's that happening. You're going to get a lot more patronage, a lot more corruption. But what seems to me kind of unbelievable, someone like Russ Vought, who is the new OMB director, has declared on several occasions that he thinks the bureaucracy hates the American people, and he actually doesn't care if it simply disintegrates. And I think you're now going to see a bunch of mass firings so that the US government is not going to be able to do the basic functions that citizens expect from it. And I think you're right. I can't think of another case in which this sort of self-destruction has been attempted.
I mean, there are civil service protections. You simply can't summarily fire someone or recategorize their positions, which I understand is one of the objectives of Schedule F. So is the logic here we're simply going to act, and if folks are unhappy, feel marginalized, sidelined, or removed, they can hire a lawyer and they can take us to court at
Well, yes,
considerable.
so
I mean, is that
that
the
that
logic?
is that is what they've done. I mean, some of the things are blatantly illegal, like the 17 inspectors general that were
Right.
dismissed. They are in this category of for cause. They're protected by for cause removals. They're supposed to be given 30 days notice. You have to actually state a reason why you're doing that, and they've simply ignored that. And a lot of people have then sued the government to try to stop this. And what's kind of amazing is JD Vance and Musk and Trump have all then attacked the judges. You know, Vance had some kind of a tweet where he said, this is judicial interference, in the legitimate workings of the executive branch. I mean, give me a break, since Marbury versus Madison, the authority of the courts to determine whether something is legal and constitutional has been a bedrock of the American rule of law. And these people are saying, actually, no, the courts don't have any right to tell the executive what it can and can't do. And that's a complete upending of the way our system is supposed to work.
Yeah. I want to move on to foreign policy, but I need your views on immigration. I mean, obviously, Trump is not just determined to close the border; he's actively deporting people. Barack Obama, I think, between 2009 and 2015, deported, I think, 2.5 million, maybe more, through immigration orders. It didn't include the number of people who were self-deported or turned away. How do you see that objective? Is some of it performative? Is 40,000 beds at Guantanamo Bay a symbol rather than a practical reality? I mean, at 6,000 deportees a week, they have a long way to go to do what Trump wanted to do, which to deport half of the 11 to 14 million migrants that are here?
Yeah, well, I think this is, not an institutional threat. This really is a policy difference. And as you said, Democratic presidents have deported lots of people. Here, I think the realism of this thrust of policy is really in state capacity, because we simply don't have the capacity
Yeah.
to deport 11 million people. It's mind-boggling to think of what would be required in terms of an administrative apparatus to do this. The real challenges, I think, are in the details, because they're going to sweep up a lot of American citizens, legitimate American citizens, in these deportations. They're going to break apart families. They're going to do all sorts of things that will be very disruptive of the economy, because they're not going to be careful about it. They're just going to shoot first and pick up the pieces later. So that's, I think, what's really at stake in this question. And I don't see them building the capacity to actually carry out, the worst of their threats.
But the amount of trauma that can be deployed and imposed on people, ordinary humans, disruption of life, is considerable, and I think is going to be traumatic. Let's turn to foreign policy briefly. I mean, again, I work for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats, and forgive me if I'm biased, but my observation here is that so far, 3 weeks, but a lot has happened in 3 weeks, that president doesn't seem to have a clearly defined view of what I would describe to you as the national interest. A lot of it is simply subordinated or tethered to any number of things: his politics, the vanity, his financial interests, whims and fancies. I just wonder, and his need to play the disruptor. The Gaza gambit, for example, is quite extraordinary. We've come up with some bad ideas in Middle East peacemaking. This clearly is among the worst. But when it comes to the really big issues, Ukraine, what do you think he's thinking?
I think that with respect to Ukraine specifically, I think he's driven by places he doesn't want to end up with rather than any kind of coherent idea. So the big fear of a lot of us who are supporters of Ukraine was that he would simply cut off arms to them and force them to accede to the kind of maximalist Russian demands. I think that may not happen. I'm hoping that that may not happen for personal reasons. Trump does not want to seem like a weak leader, and he doesn't
Right.
want to seem like he's presiding over a failure. And, you know, the worst of all would be something like the Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan, where Russian tanks just rolled down the streets of Kiev because, you know, he's abandoned this American client. So I don't think he wants that. But the trouble is that he doesn't have the leverage to actually force Putin into a real negotiation. And in any event, you know, some of the things that would be necessary on the Ukrainian side, like NATO membership or much firmer security guarantees, he's not willing to give. And so I think right now they're just treading water. They're trying to figure out how, you know, can they up the pressure on Putin by lowering global oil prices? That seems to be the only policy idea they've had, but that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so I think they're just going to kick that one down the road. But I disagree that there's not anything consistent. I think that Trump is turning out to be a classic 19th century imperialist, right? Ever since 1945, one of the great achievements of that period was most powers in the world abjuring the use of force to grab somebody else's territory. You know, Japan could be an incredibly rich country without territorial expansion the way they thought in the early 20th century. And so that was, you know, the new consensus. And it's weird because Trump never talked about this during the election campaign, actually expanding American territory. But now he's talked about Panama, he's talked about Greenland, and now he's talking about literally owning Gaza. I mean, it's
Yeah.
crazy. And I think that, you know, it does have terrible consequences for other parts of the world because, you know, one of the features of the old 19th century imperialism was spheres of influence, you know, that you want to have extra authority over places that are close to you. And well, there's a couple other great powers that want to exert authority over places close to them. Russia over Ukraine, China over Taiwan. And basically, you know, what he said about American territorial expansion is giving them a green light, you know, to go ahead and do the same thing in their areas. And so I think it's got a potential to be hugely destabilizing.
Right. I mean, 19th century imperialism, you know, I'm thinking of British colonialism here, when, you know, Britain had to staff their empire. Trump has essentially set about dismantling USAID. And I wonder, is that, obviously, he probably believes, perhaps rightly, that Americans don't care. And this is not an issue, foreign assistance, what? It's less than 1% of less than 1% of the budget. And much of the obligated funds are spent here on food. What is the gambit here on foreign assistance, do you think? Because that appears to be a huge target of the new administration.
Yeah, I think it's just a target of opportunity. As you say, foreign aid has never been very popular with Americans, although it's turning out, you know, the PL 480 agricultural products that we send to other countries, a lot of farmers depend on that. Those purchases, those American USAID purchases of American farm goods. And they're beginning, you know, that's the one domestic interest group that's directly affected by, you know, closing down AID, and they're already starting to complain. But I think in general, Trump wants to show that he's really going to cut the budget, cut bloated government, and this is simply the, you know, most obvious easy target. But they're going to go on to others. I mean, this is not going to be the end of it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on, trying to move the clock along here. We need 2 hours, actually, Frank, not 45 minutes. In an effort to help save the Republic, I've identified at least 6 what I regard as potential constraints that might, in fact, check what it seems to be a rampant abuse of of a president's powers. So I just wonder if you could comment briefly on them. First, in Trump 1.0, the initial appointments of his advisors clearly were individuals who could exercise, I mean, I don't want to trivialize this by using the phrase adult supervision, but they actually served as a brake and as a constraint. We're in Trump 2.0 now, where loyalty seems to be the currency of the realm. I'd point out Trump had 6 secretaries of Homeland Security, 4 attorney generals, 4 secretaries of defense, 4 directors of national intelligence, and 2 secretaries of state in 4 years. I mean,
Right.
Reagan had 6 national security advisors. I forgot 4 national security advisors. That's not going to happen this time around. So if I asked you whether or not the individuals around him that he's appointed would serve as any brake or constraint on his policies, what would you say?
Well, I think that that's really why Trump 2.0 is really different from the first version, because they've realized that policy is personnel, and
Yeah,
they didn't have the right personnel the first time around, and that's what Project 2025 was all about, to make sure that they had loyalists that could staff the new administration. Now, there are certain individuals in the current government that don't really aren't completely comfortable with the MAGA agenda. So I would say Marco Rubio, for example, has been a supporter of democracy promotion, the NED, AID in the past. Mike Waltz, I think, understands that this is important for soft power, against opponents like Russia and
yeah,
China. Elise Stefanik, the UN ambassador, was on the NED board for a while. So I think they're not part of the MAGA consensus. The trouble is that they're so intimidated that they're just not going to raise their heads above the parapet because it's going to get shot off.
right.
So there's a potential, if things start to really unravel and go wrong, that they'll find their voice and stick their heads up a little bit more. But I wouldn't count on it anytime in the coming weeks and months, because
Right.
Trump has really tried to fix that problem.
Okay, moving on to Congress. I mean, I only note Senator Tom Tillis said last week, quote, what Trump is doing runs afoul of the Constitution in the strictest sense, quote, but he said nobody should bellyache about that. So the next restraint is Congress. What say you about that?
Yeah. Well, it's simply another version of these people that are slightly dissenting within his bureaucrisy. I think that any member of Congress that expresses too much opposition is going to get primaried. This is what's happened, like with Todd Young. I mean, it's a moderate Republican senator from Indiana,
Yeah,
and he was mildly critical, and now in fact, that's one of the reasons they're going after a lot of the institutions he cares about, and there's certainly going to be primary challenges, so I think that he's got Congress also very, very much intimidated, and I wouldn't expect any resistance from that. You saw that in the appointments. What happened to Joni Ernst or to any of these Republican senators that were going to vote against Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard, who's the senator from, oh yeah, Cassidy,
right.
Louisiana, was really tough on
And
RFK
he's a
Jr.,
physician.
doctor, but he voted to confirm, and so I think that just shows you
Yeah,
where Congress's incentives lie.
right. Okay, well, let's move on to courts. The courts.
So the courts are the single institution that could be a real break, a real check. They did pretty well when Trump tried to deny the last election. They didn't go along with any of the nonsense that he was spouting about election fraud, and that included a lot of the judges that he himself had appointed. And in this case, that's kind of the reason why lifetime tenure for federal judges is actually a good thing because they don't actually have to worry about being primaried or, facing this kind of political blowback. So there are some things that Trump has done, like trying to end birthright citizenship, that are so flagrant violations of the Constitution that even with this conservative court, I think it's an open question whether they could actually approve what he's done. I think the more sophisticated discussion moves in this direction, that the Roberts Court may have their individual judges, like the Chief Justice himself or Amy Coney Barrett. There's a lot of people that would have objections to things that Trump has done, but the court institutionally doesn't want a confrontation because they may come out with a decision that Trump will simply disregard. And
Yeah.
that's going to be a horrible constitutional crisis in the
Right. So
United
that,
States.
yeah. So
So they
that,
may want to avoid that sort of thing.
right. I was going to move on to the Supreme Court, but you went there, and and everyone has been referring to the apocryphal statement of Andrew Jackson, who in 1832, when Chief Justice Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation had federal protection and sovereignty, Jackson was reported to have said that the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. I mean, that raises the question of what would in fact be, in a galaxy far, far away, not tethered to the realities back here on planet Earth. The U.S. Marshals would be enjoined by the Justice Department to go enforce, to some degree, any ruling that a federal court made that was disregarded. But we're talking about a Justice Department that is being run by Pam Bondi and second in command, Emil Boc. What powers exist then?
Yeah, well, no enforcement power exists. I mean, this is the realization that I think all of us had come to, that in fact, checks and balances are really fundamentally normative in nature, right? That the Supreme Court cannot send marshals. The enforcement is done by the executive branch. And when there's a conflict between the courts and the executive branch is going to win that.
Right.
And the only hope is that, the president and his minions will pull back from that kind of a confrontation, and they will not openly defy the courts. But again, that J.D. Vance quote, that apocryphal one about Andrew Jackson, suggests that they're thinking, yeah, well, maybe there'll come a point where we aren't going to obey a court. I mean, they've already done it at a lower court level, right? So there's a federal judge that told them that they couldn't withhold all this money that they're withholding,
Right.
and they continued to do it.
Right.
And that's going to go to the Supreme Court. And that's going to be the real test. If it goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says, no, you can't impound the money, there's a prior 9-0 court decision that affirmed this. There's a law that says you can't do that. If they go along with that, I'm sorry, if they try to block Trump on the basis of those very strong precedents, what's Trump going to do? Is he going to then obey them? I don't.
Well, all is not lost yet. What about the markets, Frank?
Well,
The markets as a constraint, the bond market, the CEOs, high tech.
Yeah, so here you're talking about some real possibilities, I think, for resistance, because Trump's economic policies are mutually contradictory. He can't do all the things that he's claiming that he wants to do. You cannot impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and not see inflation come roaring back in a big way. I mean, and by the way, that's just the start. He hasn't even gotten around to the tariffs he wants to impose on Europeans, Japan, Korea, and so forth. And since inflation is the thing that really killed the Biden presidency, Trump obviously doesn't want to go in that direction. The deportations are also going to contribute to labor shortages, which are going to drive up wages and will also contribute to inflation. So here, I guess the question is really, does he settle for a kind of symbolic victory where, he gets Canada to put more policemen on the border to guard against fentanyl and say, okay, no tariffs, but I succeeded. And does he actually get away with something like that? I sort of think, just listening to the way he's talked about this, that he genuinely believes that the tariffs will pay for themselves and that you can do this as a policy matter and not pay any consequences. And if that happens, business community is going to go crazy. I mean, in a way that they're not going crazy over, stopping DEI programs, because this is really going to hit them where it hurts. It's also going to open up a lot of possibilities for corruption. What happened with the tariffs the last time is that individual sectors would go to the president and say, we need exceptions. And,
right.
That then leads to the possibility that there'll be payoffs for the exceptions and this sort of thing. So the corrupting potential for these policies, I think, is really pretty great.
Yeah.
So this is the one area where I think you could get some real turmoil, that either he'll have to back down on some of these economic policies, or we'll have inflation and rising unemployment and, even a major, financial crisis.
Right. All right. I got a couple more for you before we move into the future. What about federalism, Frank? I mean, the republic's greatest strength and greatest weakness. Republicans generally are states' rightsers, and yet I find that the administration has already interceded to stop congestion pricing in New York. What else have they done? They've threatened to cut off federal funds to high schools that allow transgender athletes to compete in women's sports. They're suing Chicago for claiming sanctuary laws are hindering their efforts to enforce immigration policies. Can federalism serve as a brake and a constraint?
By the way, one more to add to that is they're going to pardon Eric Adams and get out of jail card free.
Right.
No, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, Republicans used to be the biggest advocates of authority for states and localities and protecting them from the federal government. And what's amazing about the things that you just listed is the pettiness of them. I mean, why in the world should anyone in Washington care about congestion pricing in New York City, other than they just want to flex their muscles?
Yeah, it's Trump's relationship with New York City, I think, is what's driving this.
Yeah. But it is a really petty, act of revenge. Now here, I think there's more of a chance of resistance. California would be, I don't know, something like the 8th largest country in the world in economic power if it were an independent country, and there are also these conflicts of interest that we've seen already, between, for example, Musk and Steve Bannon, where the interest of the tech community in California are really not the same as the MAGA base in Trump land, where they're very anti-immigrant across the board. They don't like H-1B visas, and there are things that Trump is going to do that will piss off one or the other of these constituencies, and that's something that I think will be something of an obstacle to his doing what he wants to do. In many cases, the federal government does have enforcement power if they really get into a fight, let's say with California or New York, but that would then require sending, federal agents or even troops into these blue states, to round up immigrants or to, get them to stop doing something. And that is a dangerous situation.
Right.
And I suspect that the administration doesn't want to have to get into that sort of direct confrontation. But that's going to be, it's one of these game theoretic things that, it's hard to know how this is all going to play out.
Will the ticking clock, I mean, we're talking 2 years before the trifecta will come under the prospects of change, the midterms in 2026. Will the ticking clock serve as a brake or a constraint, or will it accelerate what he wants to do in the first 2 years?
Well, I think it depends on what actually happens. And the biggest variable for me is really inflation, and whether there are obvious things that start to go wrong in the economy. I mean, we already saw the most recent inflation report
Yeah,
has been
today's
ticking up.
report.
Yeah. And if that continues to happen, he's going to threaten the Fed and tell them to lower interest rates. I don't think they're going to do that. And,
Yeah.
as we get closer to the election and it looks like inflation really is coming back in a serious way, that might actually induce them to pull back from some of the, the dumb things that Trump, wants to do.
Civil
So in that
society.
sense, I do think the midterms, are going to be something of a constraint.
Right. Civil society groups like Democracy Forward or Protect Democracy.
Well, they're doing God's work
They
in
are.
litigating. I mean, the single institutional channel of resistance that's likely to be the most effective is all the litigation now of all these executive orders. And, it's complex because there's so many of them, and the rights and wrongs are, pretty complex. But thank God, there are actually lawyers that are going to be contesting some of this stuff. So I think that's really where much of the action in the coming months is going to be.
Right. I mean, I'm looking here desperately 3 weeks in for some sort of counter trend that would right the ship. So I want to. We have 5-6 minutes left. Want to ask you about the future. I sometimes consult Pythia, the oracle, the famed oracle at Delphi, and she reads Godin trails, and it's proved pretty accurate when it comes to what won't happen in Middle East peacemaking. But could you foresee two sort of broad currents? One's positive, one's negative. Can you foresee a correction, a course
Look,
correction, the swinging
yeah,
pendulum? It's a big country. It's hard to ruin. There's a lot of moving parts. So that's one option.
yeah.
There is a course correction.
Well, look, I think in a way that's too easy a challenge because it's easy to spin out either a very good scenario, where Trump's policies turn out to be so counterproductive and so self-defeating that he either looks like a failed president or he really has to pull back. I mean, that's the
Right.
good scenario. The bad scenarios, I think, are, well, the one thing we haven't talked about are these kind of black swan events. Something like the Gaza proposal, the real consequences of this are not going to be in Gaza. I think they'll be elsewhere. Because essentially Trump has given Russia and China permission to move
Absolutely.
on their territorial claims. And so supposing, I mean, if I were the Chinese, I would seriously think about making the move, putting a blockade around Taiwan. He clearly doesn't want to have to use military force. He thinks he can talk them down. And I would say that if the Chinese move against Taiwan, he's going to try to make a deal that'll basically mean ceding Taiwan to China, and that's not going to look good for him. He'll try to dress it up as a victory, but I avoided World War III, but it's not going to look good for him. So there's, a lot of stuff that could happen in different parts of the world that, will really affect, his future as a successful president.
Right. But to take you back to your own analysis at the beginning, what's at stake here? The second alternative, if there is no correction, is that we've reached some sort of, inflection point, and that Joe Biden was the aberration, not Donald Trump. That the nation functioned with all its imperfections, and there were many between the end of the Second World War and the early '80s. I'm not arguing for going back. There was a lot that was wrong with the country during those years, but this didn't just happen overnight. It took a long time to get here, a couple decades at least. And could it be that, that we're at an inflection point? Presidential power is crowding out the checks and balances, populism, eroding norms, social media. I haven't even talked about conspiracy theories and the fact that a third of the country looks at empirical data and draws different conclusions than others. I mean, That's the alternative. I don't want to go there. I don't think we have to go there. I'm a believer in America with all of its imperfections, but
Yeah, so I think that in a way, the scariest thing for me is a kind of slow change in people's mental attitudes towards a lot of basic issues. One of the young engineers was briefly canned out of Doge for saying that I was a racist before racism was a cool thing. And, that's what's happening. I mean, for a lot of young men, racism is becoming a cool thing. The other thing is at a higher level, you could have, more serious intellectuals basically giving up and starting to say, well, there is something to Trumpism after all. The Claremont Institute and other places have been trying to move in that direction for several years. I don't think they've really found a purchase point where they can justify, Patrick Deneen talking about moving to a post-liberal society. But there may come a point where it simply will be much more acceptable for educated, worldly people to say, yeah, we should push our own self-interest and, hell with inner.
looks like Frank disappeared. Let's see if we can get him back. I don't know what happened to Frank. Maybe he'll come back. We're at the end of the session. I did want to close, though, with a Lincoln quote, and I've used it before because I think it's critically important to understand what the challenge really is. Lincoln addressed the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield in 1838. He was worried about the fate of the Republic. And here's what he says. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean? You're back, Frank?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry.
No, I'm glad you're back because I wanted to thank you. But I was just reading a piece of Lincoln's address to the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838. So Lincoln says, by what means shall we fortify against the danger? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined with all the treasure of the earth, our own accepted, in their military chests, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And this was 20 years before the greatest challenge that any nation confronted, civil war. Leaders, Frank, we need them.
I think Lincoln was absolutely right. The single greatest weakness then and the greatest weakness today is this internal division. I think that, Russia and China have been absolutely delighted with the rise of Trump, and not simply because he is sympathetic to them on certain issues, but because he's so controversial and Americans really can't agree on things. Support Ukraine, what do we do about NATO? What do we do about Taiwan? We disagree. And I think that that's what's weakened us in our global standing. And unless we fix that internal issue and come to a greater consensus, we are not going to be continue to be, the leading superpower.
Right. A lot of challenges. But Frank Fukuyama, I want to thank you for your authority, your wisdom, your expertise. You're a national treasure, as far as I'm And
thanks very much.
We'll do this again, and perhaps under better circumstances. Who knows? But again,
let's hope.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And take good care.
Yeah, you too, Aaron. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.